The moment you step into Fort Worth in the autumn of 1878, you feel it, a tension in the air that gnaws at your senses, an unease the wind carries across the dusty streets. And then, there is the Copper Bell. From the outside, it looks like any other saloon, a polished mahogany sign, brass fixtures gleaming faintly in the dying sunlight, the faint clink of glasses drifting from the doorway. But this place is different. Locals whisper about it as though saying its name aloud might summon something they cannot control. Children are told to avoid it. Adults cross the street when they pass. And yet everyone, cowboys, bankers, widows, finds themselves drawn inside. Inside, the smell hits first. Not whiskey, not smoke. Something sharper, chemical, almost metallic, mingled with the sweetness of crushed herbs. It clings to the air and seeps into your clothes, a subtle warning that this is no ordinary establishment. Behind the bar, Dr. Cornelius Weatherbe moves with a precision that is both mesmerizing and terrifying. His pale blue eyes scan the room as if measuring the worth of every soul present, evaluating who will survive the night and who will not. There is a tremor in his hands, a slight, almost imperceptible shake. But you notice it. It is not just fatigue. It is the residue of horrors unseen, experiments conducted far beyond the gaze of ordinary morality. The Copper Bell's patrons arrive one by one and take their seats as though following an unspoken ritual. Some are here for relief from illness, others for the promise of wealth, others out of curiosity drawn by the whispers of miracles that defy logic. They will drink his tonics, follow his instructions, and in that moment surrender themselves completely, not just to the doctor but to the unknown forces he has harnessed. And tonight, as storm clouds gather over Fort Worth, you sense the culmination of months of preparation, of careful observation, of human suffering distilled into a single dangerous evening. Because by dawn, 12 people will be dead, their bodies scattered across the Copper Bell's polished floors, their faces frozen in terror. And the reason, the dark truth behind Weatherbe's miraculous cures, will remain hidden, for now. What you are about to witness is not merely history. It is a descent into a world of forbidden knowledge, of human experimentation, of control and obsession that stretches beyond the understanding of ordinary men. Take a moment to feel it, the unease, the tension. You are standing on the threshold of something men were never meant to witness. Something that changes a man the moment he knows it, and once you cross that threshold, there is no turning back. Dr. Cornelius Weatherbe is no ordinary man, and the Copper Bell is no ordinary saloon. From the moment he arrived in Fort Worth, he carried the air of someone who had seen the hidden architecture of human suffering and decided to manipulate it for his own purposes. A Union Army surgeon, his hands had witnessed death in its most raw, unsanitized form, limbs severed, blood flowing, the moans of dying men etched into his memory. And yet, he survived. He learned. He adapted. And in the Copper Bell he found his true laboratory, a place where desperation and hope intertwined, a town whose citizens would willingly drink whatever he offered, blind to the risk, entranced by the promise of miraculous relief. The saloon itself is an extension of his mind. Every bottle, every glass, every tincture behind the bar is meticulously arranged, a ritualistic display of control. Some are familiar to the eye, amber-colored whiskies, greenish elixirs, but many contain compounds that have no name outside the laboratories of Europe or the confidential shipments of Eastern pharmaceutical companies. Were substances too dangerous for civilized populations, but perfect for the frontier, unregulated, isolated, and full of men and women willing to gamble with their bodies in search of healing. And tonight, Weatherbe has something new, something he has prepared in secrecy, hidden in crates no one is allowed to touch. He moves among his patrons like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of influence. A nod here, a gesture there, subtle observations recorded in his notebook, each human reaction logged and measured. A cough from a cowhand, a wince from a seamstress, the way the mayor nervously taps his fingers, every detail a data point. And yet, there is an undercurrent in his presence that chills the soul. Something in the way his eyes linger, the way his pale lips curve into a faint knowing smile, betrays an obsession that goes beyond medicine. He is not healing, he is experimenting, and the copper bell is the perfect stage. Outside, the storm approaches, a mirror to the chaos gathering within. Wind rattles the windows, lightning fractures the sky into violent white streaks, and thunder drums a steady, almost ritualistic cadence. Patrons sip their drinks, laughing nervously, unaware that each swallow tightens the invisible chains that bind them to Weatherbe's will. Some feel a sudden surge of warmth, a rush of euphoria that seems too sudden, too precise, too engineered to be accidental. Others notice their hands trembling, their thoughts scattering, their trust in reality beginning to warp. Tonight will mark the first true unraveling. The first deaths will occur quietly, almost imperceptibly, before the full-scale horror erupts. And when it does, no one in Fort Worth or the entire state of Texas will ever forget the copper bell, nor the man who turned a haven of hope into a chamber of terror. The crates arrived quietly, unceremonious at first, yet each one carried the weight of danger too immense for any ordinary man to comprehend. Weatherbe handled them with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion, carefully unpacking powders that shimmered like liquid jewels and crystalline compounds that seemed to breathe in the dim lamplight. There was a sound, a faint hiss, almost imperceptible, as though the air itself recognized the unnatural presence of what he had brought, and the smell, sharp, chemical, clinging to the skin like a warning, announced that tonight would not be ordinary. Tonight, the copper bell would transform from saloon to stage, from entertainment to experiment. Patrons watched, unaware that they were participants in something far darker than they could imagine. Some noted the unusual colors, blue-green mixtures that shifted and shimmered as though alive, oils that reflected the lamplight in impossible ways. A few hesitated, their hands hovering over glasses they were expected to drink. But Weatherbe's presence, commanding and magnetic, left no room for hesitation. A nod, a gentle encouragement, a flicker of that strange, piercing gaze, and even the most skeptical raised their glasses. And as they drank, the first subtle effects began to ripple through the room, a collective intoxication far beyond alcohol. Laughter surfaced first, spontaneous and unrestrained, echoing unnaturally off the polished walls. Then came fascination, staring at tables, chairs, shadows, hands turning over and over in front of the eyes. The normal boundaries of thought began to dissolve, replaced by something more dangerous. Heightened awareness twisted into paranoia, euphoria turning into obsession. Mayor Crawford, one of the city's most respected men, began speaking rapidly about plans for Fort Worth that were incoherent yet delivered with absolute certainty, his glassy eyes reflecting both terror and conviction. The cattle baron, normally stoic and commanding, whispered about conspiracies forming among his fellow patrons, his words biting, frantic, laced with suspicion. On. Weatherbe watched quietly, recording each reaction with meticulous detail. No one knew that every twitch, every laugh, every paranoid muttering was catalogued, studied, and noted. The mixture was designed to destabilize, to provoke, to push ordinary human minds toward extremes they had never experienced, and he did not intervene, not yet. The terror was not a byproduct, it was the point. The copper bell had become a crucible where fear, pleasure, and chemical manipulation fused into something alive, something that could bend the will of any man or woman who drank. And yet, despite the growing unease in the room, despite the first flickers of panic and the subtle transformations of behavior, no one could leave. Social pressure, trust in the man they believed was a healer, and a primal curiosity chained them to their seats. They were trapped by hope, by fear, and by the invisible hand of Cornelius Weatherbe. By the time the night was half over, the first of the 12 would be dead, their final moments a terrifying preview of the chaos that would consume the copper bell. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A twitch here, a stammer there, as the chemical cocktail Weatherbe had prepared began its sinister work. At first it seemed like harmless eccentricity, a laugh too loud, a gaze that lingered unnervingly on a shadow. But then the edges of reality began to fray. Samuel Hutchkins, the man whose arthritis had been cured, began scratching at his arms as though invisible insects crawled beneath his skin. His fingers tore into flesh, leaving crimson trails he seemed unable to notice. A scream erupted from the banker's widow, Martha Ellsworth, who claimed the walls were closing in, that the copper bell itself was trying to crush her. The oil lamps flickered violently with the storm outside, casting grotesque shadows that danced across panicked faces. The first death came quietly, almost anticlimactically. Pete Garrison, a weathered cattle driver, collapsed in the middle of the silo. His body convulsing violently as though every muscle and bone were rebelling against the unseen poison coursing through his veins. Witnesses recoiled, some stepping back in horror, others frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Weatherbe leaned over him, notebook in hand, not with sorrow, but with intense curiosity, recording every spasm, every distorted expression, every gasp of terror. The townsfolk did not yet realize they could not. This was the beginning. The first of 12 would fall before the night's end, each death escalating the terror around them. The storm outside mirrored the unfolding chaos within. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolling in deep, violent waves. Rain pummeled the streets, water flooding the muddy roads, turning the town into a torrent of nature's fury. Inside, the saloon became an arena of madness. Patrons accused one another of conspiracies, some grabbed bottles and chairs as weapons, and the first fights erupted. Rationality had been chemically stripped away, leaving only instinct, fear, and hallucination. It was not alcohol, not anger. It was deliberate, controlled, orchestrated by Weatherbe's hands. Every reaction, every scream, every terrified glance was catalogued for study, for experimentation. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a horrifying order. Weatherbe moved among them like a shadow, untouched by the storm of panic around him, administering new mixtures to those he observed faltering, watching the escalation with a fascination that blurred the line between genius and monstrosity. His eyes, pale and unblinking, scanned the room for anomalies, for reactions, for the subtle ways the human mind could be bent, broken or twisted. This was no longer a saloon. This was a laboratory of terror, a place where 12 men and women would pay with their lives to advance the dangerous knowledge of one man. And in that moment, and you understand something essential. The copper bell is a lesson in obedience, in manipulation, in the terrifying power of someone who knows the exact weakness of the human mind. Tonight, the ordinary laws of morality, law, and safety do not apply. Tonight, only Weatherbe's design rules. By the time the storm reached its crescendo, the copper bell was unrecognizable. The air, thick with chemical fumes and the stench of panic, pressed against the skin like a physical force. Patrons no longer spoke in sentences. They shouted, whispered, and babbled, their minds splintered into fragments too sharp to fit together. Mayor Crawford ranted about imaginary conspiracies, accusing those closest to him of plotting against the city, while Harrison Wade, the cattle baron, brandished a chair like a weapon, convinced the room was conspiring to steal his land and his wealth. The laughter that had started earlier now warped into guttural cries, twisted into screams that reverberated against walls as solid as stone, yet somehow felt like the room itself was closing in. Samuel Hutchkins clawed at his arms and face with bloodied hands, screaming about insects crawling beneath his skin. Martha Ellsworth tore at the curtains, convinced the windows were trapping her in some invisible cage. Their bodies convulsed in ways no one could rationalize, limbs bending, muscles tensing as if controlled by forces beyond their own volition. The bystanders, caught in the chemical storm, hesitated between horror and fascination, unable to intervene as their peers became living canvases of Weatherbe's experiment. Every glance, every movement was recorded in Weatherbe's precise handwriting, each observation building a map of human fear and chemical influence that no law or morality could touch. And yet, amid the chaos, Weatherbe remained eerily composed. He moved between his patrons like a shadow, speaking in low, authoritative tones that momentarily anchored the afflicted to reality, then releasing them back into the spiral of madness. The substances he administered were more than hallucinogens or stimulants. They were precision instruments designed to destabilize, to provoke paranoia, to create obedience through terror. This was control at its most intimate, its most horrifying. Every laugh, scream, and frantic gesture was a note in the symphony he conducted, a symphony whose final crescendo would be measured in death. Lightning struck the street outside, illuminating the copper bell in harsh, intermittent bursts. Shadows leaped across the walls, blending with the panicked movements of the afflicted to create the illusion of monsters crawling along the ceiling. The patrons were trapped in a hall of mirrors, their own fears amplified by chemistry, environment, and the singularly manipulative presence of Cornelius Weatherbe. By this point, some had already succumbed to the mixture entirely, their minds fracturing beyond repair, their bodies trembling as though trying to escape the confines of their own flesh. The lesson of the night is undeniable. The human mind is fragile, malleable, a tool that can be shaped by one who understands its hidden mechanisms. And Cornelius Weatherbe understands more than anyone should. He does not merely heal. He does not merely experiment. He dominates, orchestrates, and bends the living to his will. Tonight, 12 souls will pay the ultimate price to illuminate truths too dangerous for ordinary eyes. The chemical concoction had done its work. Rational thought evaporated like dew in the sun, leaving only instinct, fear, and raw aggression. Chairs flew across the room, glasses shattered, spraying amber liquid across terrified faces. Samuel Hutchins lunged at a man he swore was an insect in disguise, fingers clawing at flesh and clothing alike. The man tried to defend himself, but his movements were sluggish, his mind fogged, and he fell under Hutchins' manic assault. Screams multiplied, a chorus of human panic punctuated by the storm's relentless drum outside. The Copper Bell was no longer a saloon. It was a battlefield, a living experiment in terror. Martha Ellsworth, still convinced the walls were closing in, slammed against a window, glass cracking under her desperate blows. A child who had been quietly observing from the doorway let out a piercing cry, adding to the cacophony. Mayor Crawford, enraged and disoriented, grabbed a broken bottle, swinging it at anyone who came near. His words made no sense, accusations spilling faster than his shaking hands could articulate. Each action was amplified by the chemicals flowing through his veins, each reaction more extreme than the last. Ordinary men became monsters, ordinary women became lunatics, and Weatherbe watched it all unfold with clinical fascination. In one corner, two patrons locked in a struggle over imagined betrayals knocked a table over, scattering bottles and powders across the floor. The acrid smell intensified, mingling with blood and sweat. Each inhalation drew them deeper into the nightmare Weatherbe had engineered. Some tried to flee, but the storm outside made escape nearly impossible, forcing them back into the chaos that had already claimed the sanity of half the room. The doctor's instructions, delivered in calm, measured tones, seemed almost invisible to the chemically enhanced frenzy of those around him. And yet, there was method within this madness. Weatherbe's eyes never left the room. Every erratic movement, every scream, every delusion was observed, noted, and categorized. He knew exactly which compounds would push someone over the edge, which mixtures induced aggression, which inspired hallucinations, and which would break the mind entirely. The 12 deaths he planned were not accidents, they were outcomes, inevitable consequences of his meticulous calculations. Each act of violence, each scream, each desperate gesture was a proof of concept, a demonstration of the terrifying power he wielded over human flesh and psyche. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within, lightning flashing in blinding bursts, thunder shaking the walls, rain hammering against the windows like bullets. And inside, the Copper Bell became a crucible of human despair, a chamber where life, sanity, and civility dissolved under the calculated cruelty of one man. Tonight, 12 souls would pay with their lives, their bodies becoming instruments in Weatherbe's symphony of horror, leaving the survivors with memories too dark to ever speak aloud. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable amidst the screaming and chaos, but the first body finally crumpled to the floor. Pete Garrison, the cattle driver, had convulsed violently for minutes, his eyes rolling back, mouth frothing. When he fell, the sound of his body hitting the wood seemed to silence the room for a fraction of a second, a heartbeat of dread before the panic resumed with renewed intensity. No one could process what had happened. Some froze, staring at the lifeless figure, hearts pounding with an instinctive, paralyzing fear. Others, still under the influence of Weatherbe's chemicals, were too disoriented to even recognize death as final. Weatherbe knelt beside Garrison with meticulous calm. Pale eyes flicking from notebook to body, he checked pulses, murmured notes, adjusted the fallen man's limbs, as though ensuring every detail of the collapse was preserved for later study. There was no grief, There was no apology. There was only the detached precision of a surgeon in a laboratory, a man who had long since removed morality from his calculations. The Copper Bell was not a place for compassion tonight. It was a theater, a controlled experiment where life and death were tools in the hands of the master. Around him the storm raged and the chemical hysteria surged. Patrons stumbled over each other, screaming about hallucinations, imagined threats, invisible attackers. Hutchkins, still clawing at his own flesh, shrieked in terror at shadows that didn't exist. Ellsworth pounded at the walls, trying to escape some intangible force. Every second, every breath, every movement seemed amplified, the storm outside acting as a mirror to the madness within. And yet, the survivors felt powerless to intervene. Some realized the gravity of the deaths, some clung desperately to the illusion that it was all temporary, but none could escape the invisible grip Weatherbe had woven over them. The Copper Bell was no longer a saloon. It was a crucible of terror, an arena where human instinct and chemical manipulation collided violently. Each moment brought the next death closer, the atmosphere thick with fear, blood, and the metallic tang of anticipation. Patrons who had laughed only minutes ago now screamed in hysteria, each believing themselves to be the next victim, each swayed by the invisible currents of control that only Weatherbe could orchestrate. And through it all, the doctor remained calm, unshaken, meticulous. He knew which mixture had triggered which reaction, which mind would break next. The deaths were not random, they were inevitable. 12 souls would be extinguished before dawn, each one a testament to the terrifying precision of Cornelius Weatherbe, the man who had turned Fort Worth's most beloved establishment into a chamber of controlled terror. By the time the clock neared 9, the Copper Bell was no longer recognizable as a place of healing or leisure. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor, some twitching, some eerily still, while others thrashed in half-conscious panic, trapped between reality and hallucination. One by one, the town's most respected citizens, the mayor, the cattle baron, a prominent merchant, succumbed to the cocktail of chemicals Weatherbe had devised, their minds shattered, their bodies betraying them in grotesque contortions. The room smelled of iron and sweat, chemicals mingling with fear in a suffocating cloud that made breathing laborious, each inhale a reminder of the invisible threat that coursed through every patron. Hutchkins, now completely unmoored, tore at his face, leaving trails of blood that mirrored the chaos of the storm outside. Ellsworth's screams punctuated the air like gunshots, her hands striking walls, windows, anything she could reach in a desperate attempt to escape. Mayor Crawford, standing momentarily on a chair, accused everyone in the room of treachery, pointing fingers that no one could follow, his mind collapsing into paranoia more absolute than anything witnessed before. Patrons who had only moments ago been skeptical now attacked one another, swinging chairs, bottles, anything they could grasp, each assault fueled by chemical-induced delusions of betrayal, and all the while Weatherbe observed, pale eyes, unblinking, meticulous. Each scream, each twitch, each wild gesture was logged, analyzed, a piece of a puzzle only he could understand. Deaths did not disturb him, they fascinated him. 12, he knew, would fall before dawn. 12 souls would be measured, catalogued, transformed into data points for a man who treated terror as a tool, fear as a metric, and human suffering as science. No law, no morality, no plea could touch the order he imposed within this chaos. Lightning streaked across the prairie sky, illuminating the Copper Bell in violent, strobing flashes, casting grotesque shadows over the writhing bodies. The storm roared as if in resonance with the destruction inside, each clap of thunder punctuating the agony, each flash of lightning revealing another victim. Outside, the townsfolk who had come too late could only peer through rain-soaked windows, powerless to intervene, unable to comprehend the scale of the horror unfolding within the once revered saloon. And as the night deepened, the first clusters of deaths occurred almost simultaneously, bodies toppled in spasms of chemical torment, their faces frozen in fear, confusion, and pain. The survivors, those who had not yet succumbed, stood paralyzed, staring at the carnage, realizing in that instant that nothing in Fort Worth, nothing in their understanding of the world could have prepared them for this. They were witnessing not just death, but the cold, deliberate orchestration of it, and they were trapped within the invisible web of Cornelius Weatherbe's control. By now, rational thought had all but vanished in the Copper Bell. The survivors were no longer simply frightened, they were broken. The chemicals Weatherbe had administered coursed through their systems, twisting perception and amplifying every fear, every insecurity, every latent suspicion. Shadows became predators, whispers in the room became conspiracies, and every glance was interpreted as a betrayal. Friends turned on friends, strangers attacked strangers, and the air vibrated with the raw intensity of human panic. It was a mindscape of madness, orchestrated with precision by a man who understood that terror, like a scalpel, could cut deeper than any blade. Some of the patrons began hearing voices, soft at first, then insistent, commanding, coaxing them toward violence. One man, convinced his neighbor had poisoned his drink, lunged with a chair, striking the unfortunate target in the temple. A scream echoed through the room, answered by another, as someone else misinterpreted the sound as an attack on themselves. The chaos was compounding, a chain reaction fueled by paranoia and the chemical cocktail. Weatherbe recorded everything, every twitch, every scream, every irrational movement became data, proof of the human mind's vulnerability when subjected to the right stimuli. Martha Ellsworth, whose consumption cure had made her a faithful believer, now clawed at the walls, screaming about shadows moving in the oil lamplight. Her hysteria was contagious, infecting those around her, amplifying their terror. Hutchkins, bloodied and frantic, whispered to no one in particular about the insects crawling beneath the skin of everyone in the room. Even those who had initially been skeptical were now participants in the nightmare, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. Every corner of the Copper Bell became a theater of terror, a stage for chemical-induced horror. Weatherbe moved among them like a ghost, calm, precise, a conductor guiding a symphony of human collapse. He whispered directions, adjusted doses, handed glasses of colored liquids with the same care he might use with surgical instruments. Nothing escaped his observation. Each terrified gesture, each delusional accusation was anticipated, measured, and manipulated. In his hands, fear was a tool, and obedience, a byproduct of terror, was complete. And then came the subtle, almost imperceptible shift. Survivors began turning on each other, not just out of fear, but under suggestion. Eyes darted, hands grasped, accusations spilled. They attacked one another with an almost mechanical precision, as though the chemicals were puppeteering muscles and instincts beyond conscious control. Weatherbe did not intervene. He did not need to. The panic, the chaos, the paranoia, they were all working exactly as he intended. 12 deaths were approaching, each one a calculated inevitability, and the remaining patrons were mere instruments in the orchestration of that final, horrifying tally. By midnight, the Copper Bell was no longer a place for humans. It was a chamber of controlled chaos. Bodies broken and twitching littered the floor. The air was thick with the stench of blood, chemicals, and sweat, a suffocating fog that made every inhalation a gamble with panic. The surviving patrons were no longer thinking, no longer reasoning. They were reacting, driven by hallucinations and chemical compulsion. Every shadow became a threat, every gesture a plot. The chemical cocktail Weatherbe had meticulously crafted had achieved perfection. The human mind under his influence had become fluid, pliable, and obedient to fear. Martha Ellsworth now screamed constantly, her voice rising above the storm outside, above the cries of others. Hutchkins, clawing at his face, had convinced himself that everyone remaining was part of a conspiracy to destroy him. Mayor Crawford raved incoherently about betrayals, conspiracies, and plots, pointing erratically at those closest to him. Even the merchant James Fairfax, who had been composed just an hour earlier, now cowered in a corner, shaking uncontrollably, whispering to himself about invisible threats crawling over his skin. Each mind was isolated, each perception altered, each reaction amplified. And yet Weatherbe moved among them like a calm god, observing a natural phenomenon. Each detail was noted, each reaction recorded. When a patron fell, He adjusted the doses for others. When a scream echoed, he used it to manipulate attention, to heighten paranoia. His control over the room was absolute. He did not need to force compliance because the terror itself had already enslaved them. This was no longer a massacre. It was a demonstration of power, a display of the human mind's malleability under precise chemical and psychological influence. At the midpoint of the night, the first clear signs of permanent collapse appeared. One man, slumped against a wall, ceased to move entirely. Hutchkins's injuries deepened, his bloodied hands shaking uncontrollably. Ellsworth's screams turned hollow, mechanical, as if the terror had burned itself into her very being. The survivors looked around, eyes wide with the dawning realization that they were powerless, that no one would intervene, that they were at the mercy of a man who had anticipated every instinct, every reaction, every fear. They were prey in a trap they could not see, designed by someone who understood terror at the most intimate, surgical level. It is at this moment, the heart of chaos, that you, the observer, must recognize something essential. The human mind is fragile. The human will, even among the strongest, can be bent, fractured, and redirected when subjected to unseen forces. And there are men like Weatherbe who know this, who exploit it, who understand the precise mechanisms of fear and chemical influence to dominate lives completely. Pause. Consider the weight of that knowledge. Comment the phrase, "the bell rings," twice below, not as a ritual, but as acknowledgement. A lock-in of awareness. A recognition that the line between control and freedom is far thinner than you have ever imagined. As the copper bell approached the darkest hours of night, the second wave of deaths began. The storm outside mirrored the violence within. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled like artillery, and rain lashed against the windows with relentless fury. Inside, the survivors' movements had slowed, but their minds were a storm of paranoia and hallucination. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of lamplight had become a weapon in their own eyes, and in the eyes of those around them. What had begun as panic had transformed into a cold, chemical-induced inevitability. The human body, under Weatherbe's precise influence, was collapsing one soul at a time. Samuel Hutchkins fell first in this wave. The claws at his face left deep gouges, but it was the chemical cocktail that finally extinguished him. His screams ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in the corner where he had struggled just moments before. The surviving patrons barely had time to register his death before the chaos intensified. Martha Ellsworth, now convinced that every person in the room was a monster, smashed into a table, sending bottles and broken glass flying. Her movements were erratic, but the chemical influence ensured that she would not stop until she too succumbed. Weatherbe's detachment was absolute. Pale eyes flicking from notebook to victim, he observed, noted, and anticipated every twitch, every convulsion, every scream was recorded. Each death was not an accident, not a loss. It was data, proof of his understanding of human fragility, chemical manipulation, and psychological domination. He adjusted doses for the remaining patrons, delivering just enough to push one over the edge, to prolong the experiment, to ensure maximum observation. The copper bell had become a laboratory, a crucible of human suffering, a place where morality had no place, only observation and control. The remaining survivors were now fully under his influence. They lashed out at each other, their actions more violent and erratic with every passing second. The mayor, the cattle baron, and a handful of prominent merchants fought and screamed in a haze of hallucinations and chemical fury. The storm outside intensified, thunder rattling the walls as if echoing the terror within. The room reeked of iron, chemicals, and sweat, and every sound, every scream, every shattering bottle was amplified by the oppressive darkness and the psychological torment that had become a constant presence. And yet, amidst the carnage, there was structure, there was method. Weatherbe's cold orchestration was undeniable. 12 deaths were planned, and each was approaching with mathematical precision. The remaining patrons were not escaping. They were stepping directly into the machinery of horror he had created. Their minds and bodies, once full of hope, ambition, and reason, were now instruments in a symphony of controlled terror, and every second brought them closer to their inevitable end. By the hour before dawn, the copper bell had become a mausoleum of twisted bodies and shattered minds. The survivors of the first wave were now slipping into the second, their screams punctuated by the relentless storm outside. The air was thick with smoke, chemicals, and the coppery tang of blood, each inhalation a suffocating reminder of the inevitability that hung over the room. Every patron's perception was warped beyond repair. Walls shifted, floors heaved, shadows danced with a life of their own. Nothing was real, yet everything felt lethally immediate. Martha Ellsworth, her mind consumed by hallucinations of crawling insects, fell against a chair, breaking it, before collapsing completely. Her screams ended abruptly, replaced by a haunting silence that hung over her corner like a shadow. Hutchkins, already a bloody, trembling figure, convulsed violently, the chemical toxins overriding every motor function. His final moments were a grotesque display of human fragility, the last vestiges of reason ripped from him with terrifying precision. Others followed swiftly, driven not by natural cause, but by the engineered terror and calculated doses of Weatherbe's elixirs. Weatherbe moved among the chaos like a surgeon inspecting a procedure, unblinking, meticulous, almost reverential. He observed, documented, and subtly manipulated the remaining victims with gestures so slight they seemed imperceptible. A tilt of a glass, a whispered command, the careful adjustment of a powder, each action nudged the patrons closer to their inevitable collapse. Death, under his orchestration, was not random. It was inevitable, unavoidable, and delivered with cold precision. He was not merely a man, he was a mechanism of control, bending fear, chemistry, and human instinct into a lethal instrument. The remaining survivors were now trapped in a loop of terror, unable to distinguish hallucination from reality, friend from foe. They lashed out at each other, their paranoia magnified by the substances running through their veins. Chairs flew, bottles shattered, and screams ricocheted through the saloon with a rhythm that seemed almost choreographed. Each death fueled the hysteria of the living, who move, like marionettes in Weatherbe's invisible hands, one step closer to their own demise, and in the center of it all, Weatherbe remained untouched by chaos, untouched by morality. He observed the final victims with the same detached fascination he might have given to an experiment in a laboratory. 12 deaths would mark the night. 12 human souls reduced to instruments of observation would demonstrate the ultimate truth, that fear and chemical influence, when wielded by a mind as precise and remorseless as Cornelius Weatherbe's, can dominate, destroy, and dictate the fate of any man, no matter his stature, wealth, or influence. As the first light of dawn threatened the horizon, the copper bell was unrecognizable. What had once been a bustling saloon, a place of hope and social gathering, had been transformed into a chamber of calculated horror. 12 deaths were no longer a possibility. They were imminent. The survivors were skeletal versions of themselves, minds shredded, instincts enslaved to fear and chemical manipulation. Every gesture, every breath, every heartbeat was now controlled, guided, and manipulated by the cold hand of Cornelius Weatherbe. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within, though the violence outside was natural, predictable, benign compared to what transpired inside these walls. Lightning illuminated the twisted figures in stark white flashes, revealing faces frozen in terror, limbs contorted in impossible angles, and blood smeared like ritual paint across the floorboards. Some tried to flee, but the doors were crowded with bodies, and the storm had rendered escape nearly impossible. Even if they had reached the street, they would have been too late. Their minds were already compromised beyond repair. The chemical symphony Weatherbe conducted had already struck its final notes. One by one, the remaining patrons succumbed. Mayor Crawford's accusations became incoherent babbling before his body gave out entirely. Harrison Wade's paranoia reached its apex, and he collapsed in a heap of spasms and blood, clutching at the imagined conspirators that had haunted him all night. Each death reverberated across the copper bell, feeding the chemical hysteria in the few who remained alive, driving them closer to the same inevitable end. The room was alive with terror, a self-perpetuating organism, each death fueling the next. Weatherbe remained at the center, untouched, meticulously recording every reaction, every final twitch of each victim. He moved with the precision of a master surgeon, adjusting doses, observing reactions, taking notes. Each death was both an end and a data point. 12 souls would be extinguished tonight, and through them he would achieve a level of understanding of fear, chemical influence, and human psychology that no man had ever possessed. The Copper Bell was no longer a saloon. It was a laboratory of suffering, and he its unchallenged god. By the final moments, the survivors were little more than shadows, their minds fragmented, bodies trembling uncontrollably. Their eyes, wide with terror, reflected the storm outside, the chaos within, and the inevitability of their own demise. There was no courage left, no hope. Only fear, chemically amplified, psychologically manipulated, and inescapably complete. The first light of morning would reveal 12 lifeless bodies, but the true horror, the orchestrated, deliberate collapse of minds and souls, would remain invisible to the world outside. When the first grey light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, the Copper Bell was silent. 12 souls had been extinguished, their bodies scattered across the floorboards in grotesque positions, each a testament to the night's orchestrated terror. The survivors, if they could even be called that, were huddled in corners, shivering, trembling, their minds fractured by fear, chemicals, and the weight of witnessing the unimaginable. Some could barely comprehend what had occurred, while others, dazed and catatonic, stared at walls that had never been moving but now seemed forever haunted. The air was thick with the coppery stench of blood, the acrid tang of spilled chemicals, and the unmistakable odor of fear. Every surface bore traces of chaos: broken furniture, shards of glass, overturned tables, and pools of liquid that had once promised health, but now spoke only of death. The storm outside had finally abated, leaving a damp, heavy stillness that only magnified the eerie quiet inside. In this silence, the survivors were left to confront the aftermath. Bodies they had loved, trusted, or respected lying lifeless, transformed into instruments of Weatherbe's cold, meticulous experiment. Cornelius Weatherbe stood amidst the wreckage, pale eyes scanning the scene with the same detached intensity that had defined him all night. He took notes in a precise hand, recording the reactions, deaths, and physiological responses with scientific rigor. There was no remorse, no moral conflict. The 12 deaths were outcomes, data points, confirmation of a hypothesis he had meticulously crafted over months of preparation. For him, the night had been perfect, a masterclass in the manipulation of human fear, paranoia, and mortality. Outside, townsfolk began to gather, drawn by the aftermath, the broken windows, the faint echoes of screams, and the storm's ruinous traces. Inside, the survivors recoiled from the gaze of others, their faces pale and eyes hollow. Some whispered fragments of what they had seen, but the full scope was too horrifying to articulate. Even those who escaped chemical collapse carried the invisible scars, the psychic imprint of terror that would haunt every waking moment for the rest of their lives. And Weatherbe, observing them all, understood one fundamental truth. Fear, when orchestrated with precision, was more powerful than any weapon. He had proven it. 12 deaths had cemented his understanding, but more importantly, they had demonstrated to the survivors and to himself the absolute fragility of human perception, the ease with which minds could be twisted, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed. The Copper Bell was no longer just a saloon. It was a monument to terror, a testament to the genius and cruelty of the man who had orchestrated it. By the time Fort Worth's citizens fully grasped the scale of what had occurred, the Copper Bell had already begun its transformation in the public eye, from a place of tragedy to a site of whispered curiosity, fear, and respect. Official records were sparse, vague, and carefully worded. Accidental deaths and nervous collapse became the sanitized explanations for 12 lives extinguished under circumstances that defied rational comprehension. Local authorities, many of whom had partaken in Weatherbe's treatments themselves, were hesitant to challenge him, aware that exposure might implicate them or disrupt the fragile economic and social order. The truth was buried in plain sight, its presence felt but never acknowledged. Whispers spread faster than facts, twisting into rumors that amplified the mystery and horror of the Copper Bell. Some spoke of miraculous cures, miraculous deaths, and a doctor whose knowledge exceeded the boundaries of morality. Others told tales of the screams that echoed through the night, the writhing figures, the chemical elixirs that could heal or destroy with equal certainty. The line between legend and reality blurred rapidly, and Weatherbe understood that ambiguity was his most powerful weapon. The town's collective memory, fractured and fearful, became a fertile ground for manipulation, allowing him to maintain authority without overt coercion. Even those who had witnessed the horrors firsthand were reluctant to speak openly. Survivors, traumatized beyond comprehension, either disappeared into isolation or became devout advocates of the Copper Bell's miraculous treatments. Compelled by the residual effects of Weatherbe's chemicals, their loyalty a mixture of fear, dependency, and psychological conditioning, the very people who should have exposed him were now instruments of his influence, their memories manipulated, their perception of reality forever altered. Economic and social incentives further cemented his power. The Copper Bell had become indispensable, attracting business from across Texas. Hotels, merchants, and cattle barons who relied on the thriving community turned a blind eye, valuing profit and social prestige over moral clarity. Mayor Crawford, despite knowing the horrors firsthand, defended the doctor, framing the events as tragic yet unavoidable accidents. A convenient narrative that preserved the town's reputation while allowing Weatherbe to operate unhindered. And through it all, Cornelius Weatherbe remained unchallenged, his reputation a paradoxical mix of fear, reverence, and whispered awe. He had proven not just the lethality of his concoctions, but the malleability of human perception, the power of psychological manipulation, and the invisible chains that fear could forge. The Copper Bell was no longer simply a saloon or a laboratory. It had become a monument to his mastery, a testament to the terrifying potential of one man who understood human frailty better than anyone else in Fort Worth, or perhaps in the entire nation. Even after the night of 12 deaths, Cornelius Weatherbe did not stop. In fact, he intensified his control. The survivors who remained, those who had been chemically and psychologically altered, were his instruments now. Their fear, dependence, and fragmented perception ensured they could not resist or expose him. They became silent witnesses, their very presence a warning to anyone who might question the doctor's authority. Weatherbe understood a truth most men never learn: terror, when combined with subtle psychological conditioning, binds more effectively than chains, locks, or threats. He continued to refine his elixirs, distributing them in smaller controlled doses under the guise of preventive health. Families trusted him, cattle barons respected him, even the local authorities refrained from interference. The Copper Bell became a stage for social and medical influence, where the doctor exercised control not through violence alone, but through dependency, loyalty, and fear. Those who resisted were subtly discredited or disappeared into anonymity, their absence a warning carefully noted but never explicitly acknowledged. Weatherbe's methods went beyond chemicals. He observed patterns in human behavior, cataloging reactions, vulnerabilities, and fears, using them to manipulate social dynamics within Fort Worth. Rival businessmen, wary citizens, even curious doctors who sought the truth, found themselves ensnared in an invisible web. One false word, one misstep, and they became instruments of their own fear, hesitant, paranoid, constrained by the anticipation of a threat they could not identify. In this way, Weatherbe's dominion extended far beyond the Copper Bell, seeping into the psychology of the entire town. The town itself became a controlled environment, a laboratory of social influence. Weddings, business deals, and civic decisions were subtly shaped by the ever-present specter of Weatherbe's authority. His patrons, now psychologically conditioned, acted as extensions of his will, spreading influence, defending him, and suppressing dissent without conscious realization. Fort Worth was no longer simply a city. It was a test subject, an experiment in obedience and perception, watched, measured, and manipulated with clinical precision. And yet, Weatherbe never revealed the full scope of his knowledge. He allowed rumors, whispers, and legends to fill the gaps, controlling narratives, feeding fear, and ensuring that even those outside the Copper Bell perceived him as both miracle worker and untouchable figure. In his hands, ambiguity became power, horror became loyalty, and knowledge became domination. Every eye that watched him, every mind that feared him, every heart that depended on him was another confirmation of a terrifying reality: that one man, Understanding the mechanics of fear and influence could bend an entire community to his will with seemingly invisible threads. As months passed, Cornelius Weatherbe's ambitions grew darker. The Copper Bell was no longer merely a saloon or a place for experimental treatments. It had become a laboratory of human endurance, a theater for psychological and chemical manipulation that few could survive intact. Weatherbe understood that fear was a lever, but it alone was insufficient for total domination. He needed to push the human mind and body to their absolute limits, to observe the thresholds where reason broke, instincts seized, and survival instincts intertwined with paranoia. He began selecting new subjects from the town, both willing patrons and those whose lives he could subtly manipulate into compliance. He invited them under the guise of health treatments, social experiments, or community therapeutic interventions. Once inside, the elixirs he administered were stronger, more unpredictable, more invasive. Some caused hallucinations that extended for days, others induced temporary paralysis or uncontrollable convulsions, and always, Weatherbe observed, recording reactions, cataloguing fears, measuring thresholds of obedience and terror. The psychological experiments were even more calculated. Weatherbe orchestrated social scenarios within the Copper Bell, placing individuals in situations that amplified their paranoia. Friends were made to suspect each other of treachery. Strangers became monsters in the eyes of the chemically compromised. Each session was an intricate design, exploiting weaknesses he had catalogued in prior treatments. Patrons who had once trusted him implicitly now feared each other, while simultaneously fearing the consequences of leaving his influence. His control became invisible, silent, absolute. Word of miraculous treatments continued to spread outside the Copper Bell, masking the horror inside. Families sent loved ones for cures, unaware that each dose carried a dual purpose. Healing, yes, but also observation, control, and manipulation. Those who began questioning the process were subtly discredited, isolated, or encouraged to succumb to their own fear-induced guilt. Resistance became increasingly impossible, and the population of Fort Worth, whether directly or indirectly affected, began living under a silent, psychological dominion they could not identify, much less resist. By the end of this period, Weatherbe had achieved something extraordinary and terrifying. He had created a system where a single man, armed with knowledge of chemistry, psychology, and human vulnerability, could dominate not just individual lives but entire social structures, bending human behavior like clay. Fort Worth was his proving ground, the Copper Bell his cathedral of terror, and every mind within it, fractured, fearful, dependent, was a testament to the terrifying precision of one man's understanding of power, control, and the dark art of manipulating human perception. Over time, the story of the Copper Bell and its enigmatic owner began to morph into something larger than life, something that blurred the line between reality and legend. Cornelius Weatherbe was no longer merely a doctor or saloon owner. He had become a spectre in the collective consciousness of Fort Worth. Whispers of his miraculous cures and terrifying experiments traveled faster than the truth. Tales of vanished patrons, hallucinations, and deaths mingled with stories of miraculous recoveries, creating an aura of awe, fear, and mystique that enveloped the entire town. Parents warned children about the Copper Bell, not entirely certain whether it was a cautionary tale or a testament to miraculous power. Ranchers discussed the night of 12 deaths in hushed tones, embellishing details with each retelling, how figures had writhed on the floor, how eyes had rolled back, how the very air had seemed to vibrate with invisible malevolence. The story was no longer just an event. It had become a symbol, a warning of the fragility of human perception and the terrifying potential of knowledge misused. Yet within this growing legend, Weatherbe thrived. He understood the power of perception and the value of rumor. Fear, once sown, could be leveraged to maintain control without overt action. Patrons and townsfolk alike approached him with a mixture of reverence and terror, ensuring compliance even when no chemical influence was present. His reputation became a self-reinforcing mechanism. The more terrifying the story, the greater the obedience, the more powerful his influence became. Even those who had survived his earlier experiments were bound by the myth. Their own trauma, compounded by fear of disbelief, kept them silent or loyal. They became unintentional evangelists of his power, recounting fragments of horror that only reinforced the legend. Weatherbe's understanding of human psychology allowed him to manipulate not just bodies and minds, but stories, memory, and perception itself. Through this, he transformed the Copper Bell from a saloon into a psychological stronghold, a place where reality itself bent to the narrative he controlled. And so, Fort Worth came to live under a shadow that was both literal and metaphorical. The town became a silent participant in Weatherbe's experiments, each citizen unknowingly entangled in his web of influence. Fear, dependence, admiration, and rumor intertwined, creating a social ecosystem entirely manipulated by one man. The Copper Bell was no longer just a building. It had become a symbol of invisible power, a monument to the mastery of terror, and a reminder that knowledge, when wielded without conscience, could dominate entire lives with terrifying, almost supernatural precision. Cornelius Weatherbe understood that fear, once established, could spread faster than any rumor or chemical. Fort Worth had become a proving ground, a controlled environment where he had observed, manipulated, and perfected the mechanics of terror. But his ambitions did not end at the city limits. Through carefully orchestrated social networks, subtle communication, and the movement of patrons, he began sending ripples of influence into neighboring towns and communities, each unsuspecting and fertile ground for his experiments. Visitors who had experienced his elixirs, once healed, once terrified, once dependent, carried fragments of his legend like whispered contagion. They spoke of miraculous recoveries, of horrifying side effects, of a man whose knowledge and power seemed limitless. Each retelling amplified the myth. The Copper Bell was no longer a saloon. It was a legend, a place where reality bent and lives could be altered or destroyed with a single sip. The townsfolk, eager to witness these miracles for themselves, became unwitting instruments of Weatherbe's influence, bringing his methods and reputation further afield. But influence was not limited to stories. Weatherbe began sending his proprietary compounds to sympathetic apothecaries and merchants, disguised as legitimate treatments. These preparations carried subtle chemical signatures designed to manipulate perception and behavior, leaving recipients more suggestible, more fearful, more compliant. He had learned that true control did not require immediate dominance. Slow, imperceptible infiltration of minds across distances could achieve power more absolute than any confrontation or public spectacle. His understanding of human psychology allowed him to exploit social hierarchies. Wealthy cattle barons, influential merchants, and politicians, already impressed or terrified by his reputation, became vectors for his influence. They endorsed his treatments, legitimized his practices, and spread his legend without realizing that in doing so, they were strengthening his invisible grip on an entire region. Fear and respect intertwined, creating obedience without overt coercion, a system in which one man's understanding of human vulnerability dictated social dynamics across multiple communities. And so, Weatherbe's reach extended far beyond the walls of the Copper Bell. The towns and settlements of North Texas, once independent and confident, began to bend subtly under the weight of his influence. Communities shifted, decisions were swayed, and allegiances formed in ways he had orchestrated from the shadows. Fear, dependence, and myth became his tools, and through them he demonstrated a terrifying reality. That knowledge, combined with precise manipulation, could dominate not just individual lives, but the fate of entire societies, all without a single man ever fully realizing the chains that bound them. By now, the citizens of Fort Worth were no longer reacting to immediate threats. They were living inside a carefully constructed psychological trap. Fear had become a constant normalized presence, a silent shadow that guided decisions, dictated behavior, and reinforced obedience to Weatherbe's will. Survivors of the Copper Bell's horrors moved through the streets with vacant expressions, their eyes reflecting the trauma that had reshaped their minds. They had seen what happened to those who resisted or questioned, and the lesson was indelibly etched into every nerve and synapse. Daily life itself became an extension of Weatherbe's experiment. Families hesitated before leaving their homes, workers questioned decisions that once felt instinctive, and social gatherings were subtly dictated by the ever-present legend of the copper bell. The town had internalized his authority. He no longer needed to intervene directly. Even his absence created influence as rumor, memory, and fear acted as proxies for his will. Survivors, chemically and psychologically altered, enforced the patterns he had established, unwitting collaborators in a system designed to perpetuate his dominance. At the same time, Weatherbe cemented his role as a figure of reverence and terror. He appeared occasionally in public, always composed, always meticulous, always observing the subtle cues of obedience and fear in those around him. His treatments, still miraculous in appearance, reinforced the dependency of his patrons. Each sip, each consultation, each interaction deepened the psychological chains that bound them. They began to trust him with more than health. They trusted him with perception itself, with reality, and with the invisible threads that dictated human behavior. The normalization of fear was profound. Children grew up hearing hushed stories of the Copper Bell's Night of 12 Deaths. Adults shared whispers that blended horror with awe, and new arrivals were immediately introduced to the myth, ensuring that no one entered Fort Worth without understanding the invisible dominance of Weatherbe. Through careful social orchestration, he embedded himself into the very identity of the town, becoming inseparable from its collective consciousness. Resistance, if it ever existed, was inconceivable. In this way, Cornelius Weatherbe achieved something more terrifying than murder or chemical manipulation. He had mastered social and psychological engineering. Fort Worth was no longer simply a town. It had become a controlled system, a living testament to his understanding of fear, dependence, and human malleability. Each citizen, knowingly or not, was a participant in his grand experiment, and the lessons of the copper bell, the horror, the awe, the terror, had become permanent fixtures in the town's psyche, ensuring that his influence would persist long after any single life had passed. The story of the copper bell and Cornelius Weatherbe had grown beyond Fort Worth, like smoke drifting across the prairie, reaching distant towns, farms, and trading posts. Curious outsiders arrived, drawn by the promise of miraculous cures, tales of a man who could bend the boundaries of health and mind, and the whispered horror of 12 deaths in a single night. They came seeking answers, relief, or opportunity, unaware that each step closer to the copper bell meant stepping further into Weatherbe's invisible trap. Visitors brought new energy, new wealth, and new stories, amplifying the myth. Some came as skeptics, determined to expose a charlatan, only to find themselves ensnared by subtle manipulation, chemical influence, and the overwhelming weight of collective fear. Within hours, their skepticism eroded, replaced by dependency, awe, and paranoia. Weatherbe had learned a critical lesson. The more unfamiliar and influential the newcomer, the more valuable they were as both subject and instrument. Each arrival was a controlled experiment, a means to observe new responses, to refine techniques, to expand his psychological dominion. Recruitment was as subtle as it was brilliant. Patrons of the copper bell, now altered by chemical and psychological conditioning, became unknowing emissaries, convincing others to seek the doctor's treatments, praising his miraculous methods, or whispering warnings that only deepened fascination. Fear became both lure and leash, a carefully calibrated motivator that ensured compliance. Even those who resisted, even those who questioned, were corralled back into obedience through social pressure, rumor, and carefully orchestrated interventions that left them doubting their own perception. Weatherbe understood the art of patience. He rarely overplayed his hand. Each interaction, each experiment, each subtle act of influence was measured with precision. The outsider, once introduced to the copper bell, would inevitably fall into one of three categories: loyal patron, altered observer, or broken subject. Each category served his purpose, feeding the ever-growing experiment of human perception and fear. The town itself became a mechanism for recruitment, its collective belief system a magnet for newcomers seeking either health or answers, all unknowingly submitting to his unseen hand. By controlling the narrative and carefully managing appearances, Weatherbe turned curiosity into captivity. The copper bell, once a simple saloon, had become a psychological engine, drawing in new minds to bend, break, or convert, while the legend of 12 deaths and miraculous cures fueled both fear and fascination. With each newcomer, his dominion expanded, not through violence alone, but through mastery of human perception, the orchestration of fear, and the invisible chains of psychological control that bound the living and the unwary alike. Cornelius Weatherbe's ambition evolved beyond individual control. He sought mastery over groups, over social structures, over the very dynamics of human interaction. The copper bell became a theater of layered experiments, where chemical influence, fear, and social manipulation intertwined to create outcomes that transcended simple observation. No longer satisfied with isolated effects, Weatherbe orchestrated events in which multiple variables, emotions, alliances, rivalries, and paranoia were precisely measured, recorded, and exploited. Every gathering in the copper bell became an experiment in behavioral architecture. Patrons were placed strategically, conversations subtly guided, and reactions monitored. Certain individuals were exposed to stronger doses, others to hallucinogenic combinations, while some witnessed chaos from relative safety. Weatherbe observed how fear spread, how loyalty fractured, how hallucinations shaped perception, and how the smallest nudge could cascade into panic, aggression, or compliance. He catalogued every detail, refining his techniques for maximum influence over not just the body but the mind and the social environment simultaneously. The experiments extended into psychological terror. He introduced stimuli designed to provoke memory, guilt, or suspicion, exploiting unresolved trauma. Patrons who had survived prior treatments were deliberately exposed to scenarios that amplified their fears. Imagined conspiracies, perceived betrayals, the illusion of threats where none existed. By layering these manipulations, Weatherbe achieved a form of control that was invisible, systemic, and self-reinforcing. Those affected policed themselves, maintaining the patterns he had imposed. Weatherbe also developed intricate chemical protocols that enhanced social influence. Certain elixirs heightened suggestibility, others increased paranoia or aggression. Some combined effects to produce behaviors that appeared organic but were chemically orchestrated. By mixing dosages, controlling timing, and observing social feedback, he could engineer interactions that escalated conflict, loyalty, or submission as he desired. The copper bell was no longer a saloon. It was a living laboratory of social, chemical, and psychological engineering, a microcosm of control that Weatherbe used to perfect techniques he could one day expand beyond Fort Worth. And yet, this was all conducted under the guise of benevolence. Patrons, outsiders, and townsfolk believed they were witnessing miracles, experiencing therapeutic interventions, or partaking in community gatherings. Only Weatherbe knew the full scope, the invisible, intricate web of fear, influence, and manipulation that dictated behavior, restructured perception, and bound an entire population to his will. Each experiment reinforced his dominion, each success emboldened him, and each human mind subtly altered became another testament to the terrifying precision of one man who had mastered the art of controlling the psyche itself. Cornelius Weatherbe's experiments had reached a stage where the boundaries of human endurance were not only tested, they were shattered. The copper bell became a crucible of terror, where chemical influence, psychological manipulation, and social orchestration converged into experiences that few could survive unscathed. Patrons were subjected to prolonged hallucinations, sensory distortions, and fear so potent that the mind itself began to fracture. Those who entered the saloon seeking cures found themselves trapped in a reality reshaped by Weatherbe's meticulous design. He orchestrated environments where perception and reality collided. Shadows appeared to move independently, voices whispered conspiracies, and patrons' senses betrayed them, turning friend against friend. Small doses of chemical agents were compounded with social suggestion, creating mass delusions that escalated into aggression, hysteria, and self-inflicted harm. Observing these events, Weatherbe catalogued patterns, thresholds, and breaking points, discovering the limits of loyalty, fear, and obedience under conditions no human being should endure. The intensity of his manipulations escalated with each session. Patrons who had previously experienced mild hallucinations were now pushed into vivid, sustained visions, forced to confront their deepest fears, regrets, and paranoias. Some clawed at themselves, desperate to remove imagined threats. Others attacked their neighbors, believing them conspirators or monsters. The Copper Bell was transformed into a chamber of controlled madness, where reality bent according to Weatherbe's will, and each participant's psyche became a canvas for his experiments. Yet it was not sheer cruelty that defined his methodology. It was precision. Weatherbe studied the human response as a scientist studies chemical reactions. Panic, confusion, aggression, compliance. Each reaction was measured, analyzed, and exploited. Patrons who survived were not merely affected, they were altered, their perception, memory, and behavior calibrated to the doctor's desired outcomes. They left with a mixture of awe and terror, unaware that their minds had been reshaped to serve his influence indefinitely. Through these extremes, Weatherbe achieved something unprecedented: the ability to manipulate entire groups simultaneously, inducing chaos while maintaining invisible control, shaping perception while observing social collapse. The Copper Bell was no longer a saloon, no longer a laboratory. It had become a cathedral of psychological dominion, a proving ground for methods so potent that Fort Worth itself had become a controlled experiment in human fear, obedience, and malleability. And in the shadow of his mastery, one truth emerged clearly. Cornelius Weatherbe was not merely a man. He was the architect of perception, the manipulator of reality, and the master of terror itself. After each extreme session at the Copper Bell, the survivors carried the weight of experiences that defied rational explanation. They returned to the streets of Fort Worth altered, hollowed, cautious, and perpetually alert. Their eyes flicked to shadows that weren't there, ears strained for whispers that existed only in memory, and their minds replayed hallucinations that felt more real than any tangible event. The trauma of those nights became a lens through which they interpreted the world, a filter that shaped every decision, every interaction, every perception. Weatherbe had mastered not only fear, but the subtle permanence of its effects. Survivors became instruments of their own subjugation. They hesitated, deferred, and internalized control, policing themselves in anticipation of punishment or chaos that might follow a misstep. In public, they performed normalcy, but privately their thoughts were haunted, their behaviors constrained, their allegiances shaped by the invisible presence of the Copper Bell's master. Fear had evolved into internalized obedience, a psychological chain stronger than any metal restraint. The myth of the Copper Bell grew alongside the trauma. Each retelling, whether whispered in taverns, recounted at market stalls, or passed from parent to child, reinforced the legend of Weatherbe's power. Outsiders who arrived hoping for cures were greeted by both awe and subtle terror, primed to respond to the invisible rules that governed the town. Fort Worth itself had become a living testament to his control, every street, household, and social gathering operating within the framework of his psychological experiment. Even those who resisted, even those skeptical enough to question, found themselves trapped. Social pressure, memory, rumor, and subtle manipulation created a feedback loop that rendered dissent nearly impossible. Resistance became self-punishing, fear ensured compliance. In this way, Weatherbe's dominion extended beyond the Copper Bell itself. He did not need to be present. His influence lingered like a ghost, a silent, guiding hand shaping thought, perception, and behavior across the entire town. By embedding trauma and myth into the social and psychological fabric of Fort Worth, Weatherbe achieved what few could: permanent, invisible control over a population without overt violence or coercion. The Copper Bell had become more than a saloon, more than a laboratory. It was a machine of dominance, turning perception into submission and fear into obedience. The town was not merely affected by him, it had been transformed into a living, breathing monument to the terrifying precision of one man's understanding of human nature. Cornelius Weatherbe understood the power of ritual, how symbolism, repetition, and spectacle could solidify obedience and fear in ways that mere instruction could never achieve. Very evening at the Copper Bell became a carefully orchestrated performance, a combination of ceremony, chemistry, and subtle suggestion designed to imprint his authority on every mind present. The rituals were not overtly violent. They were psychological hooks woven into the atmosphere, gestures and timing of his actions. Before any treatments were administered, Weatherbe would ring the copper bell's gleaming ship's bell. Its clear, resonant tone echoed through the streets of Fort Worth, signaling the beginning of an event that was equal parts theater and experiment. Patrons responded instinctively, their bodies and minds already primed by months of conditioning. The sound became a Pavlovian trigger. Awe, anticipation, and an unspoken obedience surged with each toll. Even those outside the building paused, feeling a subtle unease they could not name, a recognition of power long established but invisible. Inside, the ritual continued with the preparation of his elixirs. Each movement, from the precise measuring of powders to the swirling of liquids, was calculated to inspire trust, submission, and awe. The visual and olfactory stimuli, the shifting colors, the acrid chemical scent, the subtle sweetness, worked in tandem with suggestion to heighten the effect. Patrons were immersed in a sensory experience that bypassed rational thought, allowing Weatherbe to impose influence directly on perception and emotion. Social reinforcement was equally critical. Patrons were seated according to his design, interactions subtly choreographed to amplify fear, dependence, or admiration. Those who displayed skepticism or hesitation were exposed to indirect pressures, side glances, whispered warnings, or heightened chemical effects, while loyal participants reinforced obedience through their visible compliance. The rituals created a social proof that magnified the psychological impact, ensuring that each individual's behavior aligned with the collective expectation he engineered. Through these ceremonies, Weatherbe transformed simple treatments into a kind of psychological liturgy. Obedience became habitual, fear became symbolic, and the copper bell's influence extended beyond the individual into the collective psyche of the town. Each bell toll, each carefully mixed elixir, each orchestrated interaction was a strand in a web of domination that bound the population to him. In this way, he achieved a level of control that transcended mere chemistry or coercion. He became the architect of perception, the master of ritual, and the invisible hand guiding an entire town's mind and behavior. Weatherbe's influence extended beyond fear or dependence. He sought to reshape the moral and social fabric of Fort Worth itself. Through his meticulously orchestrated rituals, chemical manipulations, and psychological strategies, he subtly dictated not only behavior but the principles that governed interactions, allegiances, and trust. The copper bell was no longer merely a place of healing or horror. It was a proving ground for the social architecture he imposed, where hierarchy, loyalty, and obedience were engineered to mirror his own dominance. The rituals created a moral framework entirely defined by Weatherbe. Compliance became virtue, skepticism became weakness, and deviation was implicitly punished through isolation, social pressure, or chemical reinforcement. Patrons learned to measure themselves against the expectations he set, internalizing a system where alignment with his authority equated to personal and social success. Those who resisted found themselves subtly marginalized, their reputations eroded, their influence diminished, all without overt coercion. In this way, Weatherbe controlled not only actions but judgment itself. Social hierarchies within the Copper Bell were carefully curated. Influential citizens, bankers, ranchers, merchants, and political figures were placed in positions that amplified his narrative. Their compliance legitimized the rituals and treatments, signaling to the community that obedience and reverence were both expected and rewarded. Meanwhile, newcomers and lower-status patrons were subtly guided into dependence, their perception of power and morality reshaped by the visible actions of those already embedded in his system. Every interaction reinforced the unspoken rules of the town, creating a self-sustaining cycle of control. Weatherbe also manipulated loyalty through selective empowerment. Those who demonstrated devotion or obedience were given privileges, preferential seating, attention during treatments, and the status of trusted participant. This created a hierarchy that mirrored his mastery, binding the town's social structure to his psychological influence. Fear, admiration, and desire for status worked in tandem to ensure that loyalty was not just expected, but actively sought, internalized, and propagated by the town itself. Through this fusion of ritual, chemical influence, and social engineering, Fort Worth became an extension of Weatherbe's will. Morality, trust, loyalty, and hierarchy were no longer organically determined. They were carefully constructed reflections of his dominance. By reshaping perception and social dynamics, he demonstrated a terrifying principle. Power is most absolute not when enforced through overt violence, but when embedded invisibly into the minds, values, and relationships of those it governs. Fort Worth had become a city of his design, a living experiment in human subjugation, where the town itself mirrored the genius and the horror of Cornelius Weatherbe. By now, the line between reality and illusion in Fort Worth had blurred beyond recognition. Cornelius Weatherbe had achieved what few could, a city where perception, fear, and myth intertwined to form a single, unassailable system. The citizens could no longer trust their senses, their memories, or even their own judgment. Shadows moved where none existed, whispers conveyed messages that were never spoken, and ordinary events were interpreted through the prism of dread and expectation he had cultivated. Reality itself had become a tool in his experiment. Hallucinations were no longer isolated incidents, they had become woven into the social fabric. Patrons who survived chemical manipulation carried their altered perceptions into the streets, infecting others with panic, confusion, or awe. Conversations, casual encounters, even town meetings were subtly guided by these distorted perceptions. Each citizen's actions reinforced the hallucinations of another, creating a feedback loop that solidified collective delusions. Fear, once personal, had become communal, and nearly impossible to disentangle from everyday life. The myth of the copper bell became inseparable from the town's identity. Stories of miraculous cures, violent deaths, and strange phenomena were repeated in hushed tones, each retelling further embedding Weatherbe's authority into consciousness. Outsiders arrived seeking knowledge or aid, only to be swallowed by the distorted reality, their perceptions bent and tested before they could recognize the manipulation. Fort Worth had become a microcosm of psychological engineering, a town operating under the invisible gravity of one man's genius and cruelty. Weatherbe's mastery was complete in this distortion. He no longer needed to intervene directly. His presence was symbolic, his system self-sustaining. Citizens policed themselves, perpetuating fear, obedience, and myth as if by instinct. Social hierarchies, moral judgments, and communal interactions were all shaped by the invisible hand of the copper bell's master. Even those who attempted to resist found themselves isolated, disoriented, and pulled back into the system by forces they could not name. And at this stage, Weatherbe's experiment transcended human cruelty or scientific curiosity. He had constructed an ecosystem of perception where reality itself was malleable and human thought became both subject and instrument. The town had become a living laboratory, a testament to the terrifying potential of knowledge, fear, and psychological manipulation. Fort Worth was no longer merely a city. It was an extension of Cornelius Weatherbe's mind, a place where truth was whatever he declared, and reality bent irrevocably to his will. The night of the final experiment arrived like a storm on the horizon, silent, inevitable, and suffused with a sense of dread that even the bravest patrons could not ignore. Cornelius Weatherbe moved through the copper bell with an almost ritualistic precision, arranging instruments, mixing compounds, and positioning participants in ways that would maximize psychological and chemical effect. This was not mere treatment. It was a culmination, the apex of years of experimentation, designed to push the human mind to the edge of comprehension. As the storm outside raged, inside, the copper bell became a theater of terror. Patrons were no longer merely subjects, they were participants in a carefully choreographed descent into madness. Hallucinations intensified, fears materialized as vivid, inescapable realities, and social interactions became charged with paranoia, aggression, and awe. Friends became enemies, whispers carried ominous messages, and every glance was imbued with suspicion. Weatherbe watched, noted, and adjusted with the precision of a master orchestrator, the violence of his design unfolding exactly as he anticipated. The chaos escalated quickly. Some patrons clawed at their skin, desperate to remove invisible threats. Others attacked each other, believing they were defending against conspiracies that existed only in their chemically altered minds. The soundscape of the copper bell, screams, shouts, breaking glass, and rolling thunder outside created a sensory overload that amplified terror. Each moment reinforced dependency, fear, and obedience, embedding the experience permanently into the psyche of the survivors. By the end of the night, 12 patrons lay dead, victims not merely of chemistry, but of meticulously engineered terror. The survivors, shaken beyond recognition, were altered irrevocably, perception, memory, and trust permanently reshaped. The copper bell had fulfilled its purpose, to demonstrate the terrifying potency of combining chemical, social, and psychological manipulation into a single, inseparable force. Weatherbe had proven that human minds could be bent, broken, and reconstructed without overt violence, leaving no evidence of the invisible chains he had forged. From that night onward, Fort Worth carried the scars of his influence. Fear became ingrained, myth became reality, and obedience was internalized. The town itself was part of the experiment, its people living in a reality engineered by one man. Cornelius Weatherbe had transformed a simple saloon into a cathedral of control, and the lesson was clear. True mastery of the human mind required more than power. It required vision, patience, and the courage to confront the fragility of perception itself. The legend of Cornelius Weatherbe did not end with his disappearance from Fort Worth or the closure of the Copper Bell. It persisted like a shadow stretching across decades. The town's collective psyche had been reshaped, its social and moral frameworks rewritten, and the memory of that night's chaos etched into every corner of community life. Families whispered of the events, even those who were not present, as if the fear itself had been inherited. Children grew up hearing stories of miraculous cures and unimaginable horrors, internalizing the lessons of obedience, mistrust, and vigilance as natural truths. Survivors became carriers of an invisible legacy. Their experiences created behaviors that were subtly transmitted to those around them. Hesitation in decision-making, heightened suspicion of outsiders, the instinct to defer to perceived authority, and the inability to trust perception without verification. These patterns, reinforced over years, shaped the social fabric of Fort Worth in ways that no historian could quantify. Fear, once acute, had become structural, embedded in the very routines of daily life. The myth of the Copper Bell acted as a psychological anchor. Outsiders arriving in the town were greeted with stories, half-truth, half-legends, cultivating curiosity, respect, and an unspoken fear. Even when the saloon itself ceased operation, its influence persisted. Business dealings, political decisions, and social interactions were filtered through the lens of Weatherbe's legacy. The collective memory functioned as both warning and deterrent, ensuring that the invisible mechanisms of control remained intact, even without his direct presence. In time, the line between history and myth blurred completely. Weatherbe became both a man and an idea, the embodiment of mastery over mind, perception, and fear. Citizens of Fort Worth, even generations removed, internalized his lessons unconsciously. They learned to navigate the world with hyper-awareness, suspicion, and calculated compliance, unaware that they were performing scripts written decades earlier in the Copper Bell. Fear and awe had become habits, obedience a second nature, and the memory of one night's terror had evolved into a permanent cognitive architecture. Weatherbe's experiment demonstrated a profound truth: control need not rely on violence alone. Influence, carefully applied, could transcend mortality, infect culture, and embed itself in the very structures of society. Fort Worth became a living testament to the terrifying durability of psychological manipulation and the lesson it carried. Ride was as dark as it was undeniable. Once the human mind has been reshaped by terror, the effects ripple endlessly across time, space, and generations, leaving no one untouched. As we step away from the Copper Bell, from Fort Worth streets, from the echoes of screams that once tore through its walls, one truth becomes unavoidable. Cornelius Weatherbe was not merely a man of his time. He was a master of the human psyche, a manipulator of reality itself, and a harbinger of the terrifying potential inherent in knowledge applied without conscience. His story is not just history, it is a mirror, reflecting the hidden levers of power, influence, and obedience that shape every human society even today. What Weatherbe accomplished reminds us that fear is not merely a reaction, it is a tool, a language, a mechanism by which the minds of many can be bent to the will of one. He demonstrated that control is most absolute when it is invisible, when it is accepted rather than enforced, when it flows through perception, memory, and expectation, rather than chains, guns, or law. The copper bell was a laboratory, yes, but it was also a warning, a blueprint for how society, morality, and even reality itself can be manipulated when one understands the architecture of the mind. And now, consider your own mind. Consider the systems of influence, fear, and expectation that shape your decisions, your loyalties, your beliefs. How much of what you accept as real, moral, or true is designed, intentionally or not, by forces beyond your awareness? What invisible pressures govern your thoughts, your fears, your desires? Weatherbe's legacy is not only a story of horror, it is an invitation, an urgent call to awaken, to question, to see the architecture of influence before it shapes you irreversibly. If you feel the weight of this truth, type in the comments. The bell rings within. And again, time. Be it a second time to lock the recognition deep into your awareness. This is more than engagement. It is an acknowledgement that you are stepping into a new awareness, seeing the patterns that others cannot, understanding the dangerous elegance of power in its purest, most subtle form. Cornelius Weatherbe's story ends in legend, but the lesson endures. Knowledge, fear, obedience, myth, and reality are tools, and mastery over them is a path as seductive as it is perilous. Step carefully, for once you have glimpsed the hidden levers of human influence, you cannot unsee them. And in that seeing lies both danger and opportunity, the danger of manipulation, the opportunity for awareness, autonomy, and understanding that can elevate a man above the blind obedience of the crowd. The copper bell may be gone, but the lesson resonates eternally. Reality is not fixed. Perception can be engineered. Fear can be eternal. And those who understand these truths, truly understand them, are forever changed, forever awakened.